Hi everybody and welcome along to another episode of the Planning Pulse. It's me, Sam Batchelor, Development Manager here at Wealden. I'm also joined today by Stacey.
Hello everyone.
We thought that we'd spend the episode this week talking to you about a change that's happened recently at Wealden.
Yep.
And that is the adoption of our new council constitution, which came with some planning changes as well.
Yeah, it did. We should probably explain that isn't that new, is it? We're a couple of committee meetings in, and it's generated some questions and a bit of, I suppose, uncertainty.
Yeah.
So on the back of that, we, Sam and I, wrote out to parish and town council clerks.
We did.
To ask them if they had any questions around the committee changes.
And
process.
Fortunately, we had some that were sent to us. Otherwise, this would be a bit of a dud episode. So we thought that we'd try to answer as many of those for you today. We've tried to group them into some themes. Didn't really know what the right or best way to go about it was.
Yeah.
But this seems better. We're not then singling out any one town or parish council for questions. So,
although they're good questions, aren't they?
They are.
They're good questions, and I'm pleased and glad to be doing this because it's good to talk to them because you don't want confusion.
That's right.
Yeah,
we want to try and explain the process and changes as best we can. So, with that in mind, we'll get straight into it then. Really. So, the first kind of group of questions were around, what the changes are and why they've happened. So, perhaps maybe we should start with that,
with those,
and kind of just generally talk about why a new constitution and why changes to the planning parts of it.
Yeah, and it's sort of understood really. The questions are to test that. Why is it seen as necessary? What problems were occurring, and what the new constitution, what does it seek to resolve? So those sorts of questions. And actually, are we getting ahead of ourselves? Do people know? They do know kind of what we've done? Should we just make an assumption that because it's the headlines are Majors Planning Committee, Minors Planning Committee, change to.
Well, let's stop there because then maybe if that's the route we're going to go down, we should start from the top then.
What, and start again?
No, we won't reset the podcast. But I see where Stacey's going with this. Yeah, context. That's what we're saying we need here, isn't it? Context.
A little bit of context.
Yeah. So, right, we've said that we've now a couple of months ago adopted a new council constitution. But okay, fine. Before we get into why that happened and whatnot, what is it that we've actually done as a headline? Some of that will maybe be fleshed out with some of these questions, but we can set something out now. So, you were just about to go into it.
So it's abolition of the area-based planning committees.
So we used to previously have Planning Committee North, Planning Committee South.
And that geographical committee structure has been abolished, and in its place is a new Major Applications Planning Committee and a new Minor Applications Committee, with a little bit of change in the background around nature and types of applications that go to those committees, and we'll actually get into that as part of answers to the questions. Yeah,
some tweaking around the scheme of delegation, so which applications are decided by officers and which ones make their way to planning committee and how they make their way to planning committee.
Yeah.
And then some other bits and pieces as well that talk about how decisions are reached at planning committee.
That's right.
And other things around that.
And the other things around that, the biggest one is the numbers of seats at the committee, because there is a change to the membership of each committee. Was 12 members and it's been reduced to 9. So that's the context.
So back to theme number one then. Theme number one was about that structure and those governance changes and a handful of questions about why.
So we were already in the thick of talking to cross-party group of members via something called the Constitutional Review Working Party.
Yeah, because it had already been decided that the Constitution did need reviewing. It's just good practice. Local authorities should review their governance documents, as regularly as they're able to fact of the matter is law changes, guidance changes, and it was our time really. So as a part of that, some working groups have been set up, and
we'd been talking to them.
We've been talking to members about a planning one in particular. I know that you went to one or two others as well. But so we were having these conversations, weren't we, about what did a updated constitution need to look like?
That's right.
We were having those chats.
And you say it was our time, sort of every couple of years. So, and in all my time here, we've always done it every 2 or 3 years, just as a sort of refresh and to check that we're still the right side of legislation and law. And this time round, we were in the thick of doing that, and there were then the draft indications from government that they were about to issue some fairly significant changes, or consult on some fairly significant changes to some of this stuff. And so it was an opportune moment to do it and drive it ahead of those changes. And when I say drive it, and that is shape it from the Wealden perspective, bearing in mind, as I've said, there was cross-party membership of the group, so all political representations there. And the opportunity was to shape it rather than have it, I suppose, forced upon you by government, because once there is a change at a national level, it would be fixed. That may still come, but who knows when it will come. I think it will probably come this year. We're out to some of the consultations still run in. There's some other stuff in terms of, dare I say it, the quality of decision making and what might be described as attempting to get a more professional and considered approach to decision making, because there's some stuff that sits in the background to the changes around training members of each of the committees. Again, government is consulting on a national scheme of mandatory planning training, and that is for all members that would be deciding sort of planning applications. But one of the things we've committed to locally is a more intensive package of training for members, and we're about to roll that out.
Yeah, and I think it's probably fair to say that the questions that came in around this were very much along the lines of, it coming across as needing to be like it was a necessity for some reason.
Needed
like there was
fixing
a problem
something,
that we were trying that something needed to be fixed. And I suppose the general thing that we can say about that was that wasn't the reason for it being instigated or why we have the changes that we have. The very simple thing is what we've just said, which is constitutions and how we go about our business, our council business, just needs to be reviewed. But at the time that we're reviewing it, well, like Stacey just said, the government had introduced, their thoughts about how planning decision making should work in local authorities. But because you are undertaking a review, not only do you then talk to your members who've got thoughts and opinions about how they think those things should be run, you find out that people that provide guidance about this kind of stuff have updated their guidance, and so when you look at that, it also indicates that there are changes. So
the PAS guidance and the LGA stuff.
More specifically, that's the Local Government Association who advise councils about kind of best practice in the way that the way they do their work, and then the Planning Advisory Service, so PAS, are an extension of the LGA, and they advise planning local councils specifically on planning matters, both plan making and decision taking. So some of that's been factored in as well. So just to kind of group those questions together. I don't think that we see it as something that was trying to solve a problem per se, but it was an opportunity, I think, to review how we did things.
It was an opportunity, and I hesitate to say what I'm going to say and loop it around trying to correct a problem. But we've been doing this for a very long time, and that includes the previous administration at Wealden. And a recurring theme when you chat to members and kind of get feedback and how things been going, that sort of stuff, was a kind of disconnect between mixing large-scale majors and more minor casework on the same agenda.
So this is the thing we need to get into specifically, because that's the general point I wanted to make, which was it's not a problem that needs to be fixed.
Yeah,
However, when you start looking into it, you start hearing
I think members
paying attention to the feedback that you've got before. And this was one of the main things.
That was
that we had area-based committees which dealt with a range of planning items, and so we had conversations about whether that was the most effective way of members dealing with items that had to come to planning committee, because it's quite a thing, isn't it, to have an agenda of planning applications
that opens with several
that have a range of different types of development in them,
and then you're dealing with
and to kind of get into the right headspace when let's be clear, the considerations are different, and they have different emphasis, they've got different material considerations, and so
they're important to the, we should say, when we understand they're important to the respective applicants and the people that are affected, but nonetheless, some would be of a strategic, dare I say it, regional scale sometimes, and others would be far more local. And I think members of the public, I've heard and spoken to members of the public to say, interesting to sit and listen to a planning committee, but it went from kind of up here to down here dealing with a fence or something like that. And
so then looping it back to the kind of the phrasing of the questions we got, and like I said, the fact that it seemed to be a relatively negative framing of that change. I suppose Stacey and our take on it is, well, no, it wasn't to fix a problem, but nonetheless it was opportune. And I think maybe we're probably right to say there isn't a right or wrong approach to doing it. It's just that because of then the conversations we've had around, well, this is the nature of the work we deal with, this is how our committees have been panning out in the recent past. Do we want to think about it differently? We could have carried on the same way that we had done. We just saw, and members also then saw, some benefit in changing from that area-based approach to a majors and a minors committee. So I think maybe that's probably the most that we can say about that, isn't it, really, in terms of where we've got to.
There's a question about numbers here in this section. And it's
around,
around,
it should come up later.
Okay, all right. Well, we could do it in the next one, actually. Membership and representation.
That's what I thought. So, yes.
So these are all about who is on the committees, how those are selected and set up, how the whole substitute process happens, and then whether there is a structure to ensure fair representations when you've got protected landscapes.
So maybe we can do this one as a bit of a mixture then, because I think maybe we can say these questions out and then answer them one by one, but some of them might be similar. So the first one was, who will sit on committees? Is it a fixed group for each committee? And if so, who are they and how have they been selected?
So the start of the answer to this is that the numbers of a particular group is set by basically the balance of power in the chamber. So political representation dictates the numbers.
Well, we've got a starting point before that, haven't we? Which is, to be clear, both planning committees now have been set at 9 members.
Each. 9 members each. And then that, working back from that, is the political balance point and power. So that then gives a set number of seats depending upon the group. And then, very simply, the leader of each group will select members and also the relevant substitutes. Now, there's a slight change to the substitutes in that it's more structured now. So under the previous constitution, the leader of any party could sub on any member, providing they had done planning training, and that was a bit of an anomaly. Elsewhere, by some margin, councils had a fixed number of substitutes, and so that's the model that we've moved to. So there are now 5 substitutes for the committee meeting, and again those are chosen by the respective leaders of the council.
And I suppose you could say that part of the reason for that is another aspect of wanting to move to the major and minor format, because we wanted to ensure that we had committees that dealt with consistent types of applications, and therefore we could focus the training to those members about those types of applications. And then when you extend that to the substitutes, we wanted to make sure that the pool of substitutes that was available was also a group of members that were trained. And you could say, and again, I don't think there's a right nor wrong, but a criticism of that previous approach and have a bigger pool of substitute members is that those members aren't always involved as regularly as they may want to be in planning decision making, whereas this new format means that we can maybe focus training around that, and it would hopefully help with the point you made earlier around kind of quality of decision making, but also, and I don't want to speak on behalf of members, but the confidence and kind of capability and however else they may feel about it when it comes to decision making, knowing that they're on a committee where they've received the right training and they're happy to discuss some quite significant and controversial things that come up. So
yeah, okay, all right. So there's a question about whether these changes have seen the abolition of planning ward members, and the answer is no. There still are local planning members in each area.
Yep, and they're allowed to turn up when there are items in their area, speak to planning committee.
They've got specific speaking rights.
Got specific speaking rights.
Set in the Constitution now.
A ward member can still sit on planning committee, but you may have noticed, because we've had a couple of planning committees now, that there's a process that when they do want to address the committee, they go and take up the local ward member seat, address the committee, and that helps with a kind of physical distinction about their part at that point in time that they're addressing the committee as the local ward member, kind of representing maybe the views of their residents about the scheme at that point.
So the last couple of questions are around, again, a sort of geography point, because it's referencing whether the committee ought to be structured to ensure what's described as fair representation across the district, including AONB, high wheeled areas versus low wheeled. And there isn't an answer to that other than to say that the geographical emphasis in terms of the north-south split is gone now, but that we would cover with any members and subs on each of the committees the approach to the work that will go to those committees, having regard to all parts of the district, low-wheeled and high-wheeled. So you still would, well, I would say you still would ensure that members are aware of those issues and their obligations in those landscapes.
And it wasn't the case that when we had the area-based committees before that you only had North Committee members on North Committee or South Committee members on South Committee, did you?
No.
You still had.
That's a good point, actually.
You still had members from across the district on either committee, and so it's actually always been the case that members that don't live in an AONB patch were deciding AONB applications. So that's not changed in that sense, but we're confident, I think, at least, that because of the way in which we're now going to approach training for planning committee members, that they'll always be knowledgeable on those material issues that will come up during an application. So we don't see that as an issue potentially.
So the last question is the one we moved from the section before, and it's around what's called the quorum. So this is, I know this is controversial. There's been a lot said about this, and I'm slightly hesitant to even step into answering this question, but we asked for questions and it's been raised, so we're going to have to tackle it. So the question is, apart from the comments about decisions being taken, is it correct and appropriate for the potential for a major decision to be taken where the committee was only quorate at 3 members, because that would be the minimum number? Now, I think the context to this is this. There's been a lot said that the change from 12 to 9 and the associated reduction in the quorum, the minimum number, is seen as a problem. But I don't view it that way, and I have a different interpretation, and it is just my interpretation. But my interpretation is that the quorum is there as an absolute minimum, as an absolute break on. Well,
it has to exist, and I think we should maybe deal with that perception in the first place, that kind of all committees in all councils set out how they should be run, which includes acknowledging that not everybody will turn up or be available necessarily because of unforeseen circumstances or whatever the case may be, and that there needs to be a reference to then how that committee can continue to function. And in this instance, we started by saying that, well, the minimum that it can go to is 3. But I interrupted you.
I was just going to say that's the extreme of the scenario.
This is the point. It's the extreme, isn't it?
And it means that a decision could be taken with 3 members and be lawful, continue to be lawful, but it would only be 3 members in, as I say, an exceptional set of circumstances. Because don't forget, we've already spoken about the set number of substitutes. So there are 5 members that can, again, lawfully be added onto the committee. So in a scenario that you could see as a decision taken with the quorum, the minimum number, it would be through the absence of attendance for whatever reason, but it would be where people had been unable or chosen not to attend.
Yeah. And it would be within the committee's gift, instigated by the chair, about whether a committee went ahead in that scenario as well. So there's always that.
You mean decision taking?
Debate that whether a committee goes ahead and changing numbers and things. So there's always that check and balance with it as well.
And the quorum has always existed as an absolute rule. It's no different, and we've had it for forever.
Yeah, so. I mean, I've been here nearly 4 years now. I don't think we'd ever come close to the committees that I went to in terms of there being that level of it being close to 4. I mean, you've worked here a little bit longer, only a little bit. I mean, had you ever seen it that many times in the time you've been here?
Never.
Yeah.
No.
So hopefully there's some assurance there in terms of how it works, but it's nothing simpler than there needs to be a set
legal minimum,
which committees are allowed to continue, and that's what Wealden has chosen.
All right. So moving on then, the next one is around application types and how cases are delegated. So do you want to lead on this one?
Yeah. So the first question was, how is it decided whether an application is classed as major or minor? So for those that aren't familiar, an application is submitted having regard to something called the Town and Country Planning Development Management Procedure Order. Sounds a bit boring, I know, but that bedtime reading that defines whether an application is how it's classified, and so it defines a major planning application in terms of housing as a scheme that is 10 or more dwellings. If it's land that's more than 0.5 of a hectare, and then if it's not residential, if it's a scheme that's more than 1 hectare in site area, or if more than 1,000 square metres of floor space is being built out, be it a new warehouse, barn, some type of change of use, new retail use, etc. So we have adopted those definitions to define what goes to a major and minors planning committee. So if you go and look at the Constitution, it will say that a major application, which are the ones I just described, are the ones that will go to a major planning committee, and a minor application, which is all the ones that are smaller than those major schemes. So for housing, that would be less than 10 new houses. Fewer. Proper English, Samuel. Or schemes that are less than 1,000 square metres in footprint. So it's nothing simpler than that. That's the distinction we make, and that's what's set out in the Constitution.
Though very quick cutting to the point, you could still get some fairly significant proposals going to the Minors Committee. I think there's this incorrect perception in my view that the Minors Committee are not going to be dealing with particular controversial schemes, but there's an awful lot of cases.
The split doesn't exist, does it, to make a distinction between applications that are more important versus ones that are less important. It's just that a significant small scheme that might be complex or controversial because of how it's been received in the local area will still be dealt with by members that are trained about dealing with those types of applications, but they're not the same as an application where you've decided 300 new homes. But the Minors Committee will be well equipped in order to be able to deal with that. And it's just that we thought that distinction was better, and so that's why there's that split. But those are the types of applications that would go to one committee or the other.
So the next question is a sort of impact one, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's interesting because for those, again, that aren't too familiar, there's another way in which major applications are referred to, specifically in relation to the High Weald National Landscape. But this is a planning judgment. So whereas before I just described how the relevant legislation describes whether a scheme is major or minor, there is a national planning policy framework reference to how you should deal with applications in the national landscape. And it is a judgment that needs to be made. So it says that where an application is considered to be major in the national landscape. So that's not because it's legally a major application. This is a judgment that you make about the impact of it. It's within the council to decide whether something is major in the AONB, but you make that decision based on the location of the development, how it relates to existing settlements in that area, what kind of impact it might have on the national landscape. Those things could be down to its size, the number of units, if it's housing that are being produced, if it's a commercial use, the impact of that commercial use in that area. So it's quite multifaceted in that way. But it's quite possible that you could conclude that a new development in the national landscape was major in terms of that policy consideration. That is not an application that means it would then go to major planning committee. That would just mean that for the purposes of considering the impact of that development on the national landscape, we may decide that the scheme is major in the context of the High Weald. But if it is a minor application legally, i.e. for a housing scheme only up to 9 units, it would still go to minors committee. But minors committee might still then debate the issues around it being major. So a little confusing in terms of the fact that that's the same word being used in two different instances, but one is it's defined in law, the other is it's a policy consideration and a planning judgment that's made about the impact of development in that specific location. But what makes it go to major or minor will still be how it's defined in the law. Good stuff. That's what we've adopted in terms of the Constitution. The next question here was, does whether the application is major or minor affect whether that application is delegated to officers or not? We'll attempt to make this as simple as we can. So what we've explained to you so far is that if an application is classed as major or minor, that it can go to planning committee, and if it's minor, it will go to minors committee, and if it's major, it will go to majors committee. However, not all applications do go to planning committee. In fact, many applications are delegated to officers. So what actually dictates whether an application goes to committee is contained or explained, I suppose, in something called our scheme of delegation. That's also set out in our new constitution. Actually, very similar to this.
It's not really changed.
Not really changed. Very similar to the scheme that we had before. So there are applications that we know that always go to planning committee. So, for example, if a new housing scheme is for more than 30 units outside of the High Weald national landscape, and it's not on an allocated site, then that will always go to planning committee. That's never delegated to officers. When it's within the High Weald national landscape, the threshold is slightly lower. It's 15 units. Again, if that's on an unallocated site, that will automatically go to planning committee. Applications then that are outside of that limit, because that's the main kind of routine threshold that we have, isn't it, for housing applications. Most other applications are dealt with by way of a response to consultations. Yeah. So when we receive a new planning application, you're all familiar with the fact that we publicise them, we consult town and parish councils. If we receive a substantiated material reason for or against a planning application from a town or parish council, and that is contrary to the recommendation that officers are making, that will trigger something called a local ward member referral process. So we will contact the local ward member, explain to them the recommendation that officers are making, but also what the objections are, or what the support is for the application, depending on the scenario, and then the local ward member will decide if the application should go to planning committee. Similarly, if we have received 3 or more objections or 3 or more letters of support in relation to an application, and again that's contrary to the recommendation we're making, that also triggers the same process. So depending on whether or not that the objections or support have come from the Parish Town Council or from local residents, that will trigger a process with the local ward member, and whether the application then ultimately ends up committee is down to the decision that the ward member makes.
So we should clarify, the ward member in that scenario where you've got this referral process is taking a decision on whether the application should be delegated or not whether planning permission should be granted or not. It's just the route that the decision would be taking. And then we should explain, because it's linked to the questions, at that point the referral in process is linked to the local member giving relevant material planning considerations. And there's quite a bit been written about that. I think it's seen as a new yardstick that's in the Constitution that is more complicated, and that we're asking more and more of members. And actually, there's no change. That was exactly what the previous Constitution said. And it goes right back to the beginning that we spoke about, which is training and giving members the ability to sense check some of the stuff that's set out in reports and ask the right questions. So I don't think there isn't any change in that part of the scheme of delegation. If members give relevant material planning considerations, they can say whether, and are obligated to say whether the route for the decision should be given rest with officers, or they have the discretion to refer it into committee. If they don't give relevant material considerations or fail to respond for whatever reason, and it's a 48-hour process of working days, then it goes to the respective chair of the relevant committee. Now, the working days point is a change, because it used to be just days, and that would include... It
used to be just hours.
Yeah, well, yes, that's it. That's the right way to describe it, actually. But it could and did include weekends and public and bank holidays. And actually, the feedback from members was that actually that's quite an intrusion, and was too much of a demand on members that might be doing other things on the weekend, and might want to be doing other stuff on public and bank holidays for obvious reasons. So it's just down to working days. And so in that scenario where the member has not given the right reasons, or incorrect reasons, or immaterial reasons,
no reasons,
it would go to the respective chair, and you start the process again with the respective chair.
And then, not to kind of over-explain it, but if we don't get any reasons from that route, good, bad or none, then there's an opportunity for it to go to the deputy chair too, go through the same process. Ultimately, we're hoping that we would have heard someone through any one of those stages, such that it's clear that it's going or not, but there is a possibility that if we hear from no one by the end, that it then becomes a delegated decision by default. But yeah, like Stacey said, that's a system that we've pretty much carried on with since before, the main change being the working days aspect of it, which we've now adopted.
Okay, all right.
So in terms of the rest of the delegation, because one of the questions was kind of, has it changed? Well, you just already said, not really. No. There are some other aspects to it, but again, these were included before. So if it's a staff application or an application that's been submitted by a member, it's got a lower threshold in terms of whether or not the local ward member referral is triggered. So that's just to help with making sure that there's openness and transparency around staff and member applications. And then there's a kind of catch-all delegation, isn't there, where despite an application potentially being able to be delegated, that you have power as head of service to waive delegation. And there's no one explanation we could give about that, but you would be making a decision about the significance and the complexity of an application, its impact on kind of local communities, what it is that we might have heard about it, how controversial it might be, such that you just might make that decision earlier on to say that an application might need to go to planning committee. Use sparingly probably is a right way to summarise it, but it does exist, and you have used it before.
I have used it. Chris has it as well. Chris Bending, Director of Place, and I'm pretty sure Nicola Waters, as the head of planning policy, economic development and climate change, also retains that right as well. So sort of checks and balances if I'm not here or whatever. But yeah, you're right that not very often used, but nonetheless there is a kind of escape chute, and cases can be put to committee in the considered circumstances.
So very lastly in this section, someone asked a question about whether or not an application that's classed as minor is more likely to be decided by officers. An interesting question, I suppose, because it depends on what you mean by likely, and whether or not you think that's an issue or not. But all applications other than the ones that are major that definitely have to go to planning committee are all essentially subject to the same process, which is the local ward member process that we just explained. So regardless of whether it's major or minor, depending on the level of representation we've got on the application and the type of recommendation we're making, that will be what dictates whether it goes or not. So not that it's major or minor, it's just how interested people are in it and what kind of recommendation we're making.
And it's a neat segue into covering off the last call-in option, which is publicity from receipt of the application, because there is a quite often used route where members can escalate a scheme to committee from receipt of the planning application and its publicity. So there retains an automatic kind of, I've been contacted by this week too, there's a lot of upset, there's a lot of angst, there's a lot of concern about a particular application, and any local member, given relevant material planning considerations, can ask for an application to go to committee. And so that would sweep up that point. So even if it was very minor, if it caused upset or if it caused a concern,
and that was raised early in the process,
then it could be
could be referred by the local ward member there.
So you got a safety net, and that's not changed. It's exactly the same as before.
That's the same as before. So the next theme we've got on here actually are questions that relate to what we've just discussed. However, this last one, Stacey, I think probably would be worth answering. It says, is there any circumstances when an application for less than 10 houses can that be handled by the Majors Planning Committee?
So I think there's two answers, and the first you've already given, which is that competency of members and the training given would cover all eventualities. So I just want to make that point, because the sort of inference of the question is that there's a disparity in the
Majors Planning Committee might be better at dealing with it.
Well, something along those lines, and I think I'll take issue with that premise.
Yeah.
But the second answer is that, a bit like waiving delegation, officers retain the ability to put any application to any committee. You need a reason. You need to be able to explain that, and I'm not actually sure why you would do it. I mean, it says, are there any circumstances? I guess controversy, sort of significant controversy, but I retain confidence in the minors committee and the training given.
I was going to say, it undermines what you just said a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah,
because
well,
what we've said is a minors committee should be no less able to deal with controversy or complexity.
I think
what they'll be focused on is the nuance and the material considerations that come up more often with those smaller schemes versus the ones that are considered, whilst the same, because they're all subject to the same planning policies, but nonetheless, the issues that come up more frequently are different between them, aren't they?
I think the minors committee would be pretty annoyed if there was a case that they got bypassed on and it went to the majors committee. They would feel, I don't know, slighted perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm overthinking it.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next kind of themed set of questions was around councillor responsibilities and appeals. I think this actually...
It needs a bit of an explanation.
It needs a bit of an explanation, yeah, because I think we have had a question about this. Maybe it's got lost in terms of the order that we've tried to put them in. But before we jump into the appeal scenario, we should actually probably talk about the committee decision taking. So an application's been brought to planning committee, members have gone to take a decision on that application.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to talk about decisions that are in line with officer recommendation. That's straightforward. Committee have debated it. They're going to vote that they agree with the officer. However, what does come up sometimes are instances in which the committee want to take an alternative decision.
Yes.
One of the first things that we can explain is that there is a clear process that is now set out in the new constitution about what is expected to happen in that kind of scenario. Again, I think we've had some questions levelled at us. We've seen some commentary around that, some suggestion that it seems to be more onerous and overreach. However, whatever the view that's taken on it. again, we've spoken about this. I think our take on it actually is that it's not actually different to a scenario that we would have found ourselves in before. If it had got to a point during the debate that a member had motioned for an application to be refused or approved, just contrary to officer recommendation, what is set out in black and white now is actually a process that we would have followed or did follow anyway.
It's just constitutionally set now.
Yeah. But yeah, do you want to set out that process if you can remember it off the top of your head? We don't have to get it right verbatim, I suppose, but
because I won't. But no, it's a good point because it's caused a couple of questions and quite a bit of, I think, debate. So the process now is that the proposer and the seconder of the motion have to give relevant material reasons. Mm-hmm. They need to explain why they are taking that decision, and that particularly applies to refusals of planning permission. So the Constitution now requires members to set out a reasoned justification and a clear explanation of the anchor to the refusal reason. So usually that is a balance point and then a harm point. So you would hear us as officers ask members to articulate that. What the Constitution now sets out is that if members want a bit more time to do that, then it is at the chair's discretion where they can take an adjournment. And in fact, we've had that. First meeting of the Miners Committee, we had an adjournment for about 10-15 minutes where members worked up that reason. There was some officer input, and
we can probably just flesh that out a little bit at that particular point, because I think that we can give a view on that in terms of how it might pan out, you know, over time and how it might be used in the future. You just set out that it's, you know, chair and committee's discretion about how that happens, but it doesn't have to be that way. We're very comfortable with giving advice to members in that moment, live on camera.
Well, so I think it's a bit clunky to have an adjournment because the webcast gets paused.
You know, it's helpful anyway, isn't it, in the context of having the debate about the issues that have been raised, to hear a member talk about a different balance that they want to apply, or a different interpretation of a policy that means that they've come to that conclusion about making a contrary recommendation or contrary decision. And so actually what you might find in reality is that more often than not you will see that happen. But I think we have to accept and acknowledge, especially those that have watched planning committees before, sometimes in the heat of the moment it can be quite difficult for either the member that's raised concerns to articulate it at that point in time, and there's a lot of pressure, isn't there, around that moment, and
it's quite charged. And
I suppose again, then looking at it in terms of how people might view our input into it, that maybe some consideration needs to be about to how we might be explaining something, and whether or not it's understood, and are people appreciating the feedback that we're providing in terms of whether, you know, the impact of making that decision is good, bad, or, you know, indifferent, and that sometimes, you know, and so there's just this opportunity now in this kind of black and white approach to dealing with it in that moment that says, well, actually, if you're in one of those scenarios where it seems to be that actually there's something
it's a bit tangled, you can take an adjournment.
That we can take an adjournment to detangle it. That gives the member that wants to make that motion an opportunity just to take a moment, find some breathing space, discuss with us if they need be, kind of gather their own thoughts potentially, such that when we come back to kind of reconvening planning committee, it can all be articulated and then, if needs be, discussed a bit more clearly. Yeah.
You're right, I don't disagree with you, but just to round it off, what we've done, and for those that have watched the committee so far, we've spent time, haven't we, kind of huddling and just whispering, and I think we've annoyed respective chair because they go, well, come on, are you listening or not? And we're just actually
we've always got an ear in.
But just chatting very quickly before advising the committee, because I mean, we're saying that it can get quite charged, it can get quite, you know, people can be quite passionate around some of this stuff, and we want to get it right, because if we take a flawed decision or one that's unsound, there are implications down the line in terms of unpicking them and and procedural problems. So it's always, I think, better to get it right the first time than take a rush decision because kind of all eyes are in a certain direction.
Yeah.
That's not suggesting that members do that, but yeah. So the next part of it, because it is new, is the constitutional requirement, the new requirement that in a scenario where a contrary decision is taken, then the proposer and the seconder of the motion will be voted through by the committee, but the proposer and the seconder are then required in the event of an appeal to explain why they put the motion forward, basically. And there is a question about...
Well, it says represent, doesn't it?
It says represent.
What does that mean? Well,
yeah.
You just answered
yeah,
it. Really,
it's to explain a bit more in the event of an appeal, because, just getting ahead of myself, in an appeal there would be a written response to the decision from the applicant or their agent, most likely. And what we mean by that, the expectation in the Constitution, is that the relevant proposer and seconder would explain why they put that motion on the table via a short statement, and then it depends on the appeal route really, because if it's just the written procedure, then that would be all that was required. And the officers would provide support around that, and we would administer the appeal. We certainly wouldn't leave members alone. We would support them through that.
Well, we should probably unpack that a little bit as well. We could probably do a whole separate podcast episode on that, but I think we need to deal with that because that's what some of the inference here is with some of these questions, which is
that the members would be left alone.
Be left alone, and the fact of the matter is, what happens depends on how we can administer and support the appeal. And so there will be instances in which a contrary decision is made, and actually the appeal process will go forward like any other appeal, be it a delegated decision or one that was made at planning committee. That being, officers will defend the decision of the council. If a specialist needs to be involved because there's a particular issue around matters relating to highway impact or ecological impact or impact on trees or a flooding matter, that we'd
foul drainage.
We'd get the relevant support and we would defend the appeal in that way. However, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, which is there have been instances, and it's not unique to Wealden, where because of the decision that was taken, well, firstly, from a planning officer point of view...
You mean it's a technical objection? It's not a judgment-based decision? You mean that's what you mean, don't you? That the decision has been taken which is rooted in a technical complaint. So highways is the most obvious, isn't it?
Well, that's one example.
Yeah.
I mean, we couldn't defend those reasons anyway because we're not the specialists. But if we were unable to obtain a specialist in that scenario, then that might be an instance where, well, despite the fact that the proposer and seconder in the fully supported scenario would still be expected to turn up planning committee and give their 2 pennies worth about how that decision came to be for the benefit of the inspector, there'd be more benefit in that in a scenario where, and it's a rare scenario, but it does happen that there wouldn't be necessarily the expertise in the room to support that. That's not then saying that the councillor has to be the expert in that opinion. They just need to explain that on the basis of the evidence that was presented to them, you know, why it was that they thought that it was appropriate to come to a contrary view. And, you know, it remains to be seen what would happen in an appeal scenario, but we don't think that an inspector would ask for any more than that. They appreciate these people, that a member in that context hasn't turned up as the expert, but nonetheless has had consideration of the issues, was aware of what had been presented to them because they'd read the officer's report and they'd seen what was submitted in the application and can articulate that. However, you just made the point about technical issues. There still will be a scenario where even in applying a planning balance that we as officers might not find ourselves in a position in order to be able to defend the committee's decision that they took. Again, that happens kind of infrequently, but we are bound by, especially if we're members of the Royal Town Planning Institute, a code of professional conduct that does say that we shouldn't prescribe to views and opinions that we don't think align with good planning practice. So again, in a scenario where a planning balance has been exercised, we would hope that in most of those instances, the decision taken by the planning committee would be dealt with and administered by professionals. However, members, because of the new constitution, would still be required to represent in that instance. However,
just explain
where we can't stand up professionals in order to be able to do that, but the appeal nonetheless goes ahead, then there's that added value of members being able to go and explain the decision that was taken. Again, not on the basis that they're the experts, but in exercising their right and their judgment as planning committee members. There's a benefit in them being able to explain that to the inspector, and so that's what's being asked of, really. And in terms of questions that might relate to, where did that come from, or how did that come to be? Well, it relates to some of the advice or answers we gave at the beginning. The Constitution was being reviewed. There are, government consultations out around decision making. We spoke about the Local Government Association. We spoke about PAS. They all produce or have links to guidance or best practice. And if you take the time to look at any of these,
he was making it consistent with those.
It's to be consistent with those, and you will see references to instances where committees want to take contrary decisions. Members of those committees needing to be
to represent,
and being accountable, having ownership of those decisions, and it's nothing more than that, really.
Yeah, and I suppose the final point on that, just to close it off, or round it off rather, is that we did a load of work looking at other councils' constitutions, and we were the outliers. So it was very much bringing it in line with all those other councils.
Yeah.
So it's the last couple of sections, isn't it? Because we've been going a little while.
Yeah. Our longest episode ever. Hope you're still tuned in.
This next section is all around concerns around a kind of loss of the geographical committee base of north-south. And I don't know that we can necessarily answer these questions. So what's been set out is that as the district is no longer subdivided north-south, the question is there a risk that members that are far from an application might not attend, or that they may not understand what's going on, and that there's a sort of loss of local knowledge.
We did answer this in terms of what came up in some of the questions before, and again, I don't think I got it wrong. You seem to kind of agree and nod when I said it, but the North and South committees weren't based on the members of those committees only being North or South members. So this is similar in that respect, isn't it?
But I mean, there's another way of looking at it, which is the work that members do, and it is extensive, and it's hours and hours once the agenda's published, or once we alert members to what's coming on the agendas, that they start doing the due diligence and the work involved, and that involves going and looking and talking to people and reading submissions. So
there's still a requirement to have regard to all the information. There's still the option for them to undertake unaccompanied member site visits before planning committee.
So I think the premise of the question, I mean, I started off by saying it's not for us to answer, and we have, but the premise of the question I think is somewhat flawed in that it seeks to go behind the work that members do on each committee as part of their preparations for the meeting.
Yeah, and one of the questions then was, if we were of that view, how could that be mitigated or compensated? Well, we don't think it needs to be mitigated or compensated, but what I would say is that, what we said nearer the top of answering some of these questions, which is planning committees have mandatory training, but we've also adopted a new approach to member training because of the opportunity brought about by changing the planning committees.
And we've not actually said what that is, and I think we should.
Yeah.
So this is if you stayed 52 minutes in, or whatever it is, how long have we been going? So there's mandatory training that involves all-day sessions that would be both in offices and then out walking with, accompanied by experts. So that might be some of the specialists. It might be conservation and heritage. Could be trees. Could be enforcement. Could be biodiversity. Then we're going to do topic-based training. We're going to have drop-in sessions every couple of months where any member can attend a hybrid session, and then also a bespoke online session to ask questions about what's going on in their area. Quite a lot. I mean, it's a year-long programme that has been agreed with the planning portfolio holder, Councillor Ian Tish.
And I think it's more of a concerted effort than we've ever made before. Not that members didn't have the opportunity to kind of learn about new, not new, but gain more knowledge about different types of planning matters. This is just
we've never structured it as a rolling.
This is just a structured way
program.
of doing it. Yeah,
There'll be something there'll be something most months.
Yeah.
Okay, so then
Well, that's all the questions that we had about the planning committees and the procedures and the constitution changes. Well, people asked, so we've answered as best we can. So thank you for listening. We did actually have some questions around, the podcast and what it is and what it's about.
These are the best ones.
Yeah. So for the uninitiated, I suppose, this is the Planning Pulse podcast. About a year ago, we decided that we would try to do something fortnightly and for 5 minutes. And then after the first few, quickly realised, well, number one, they always take way longer than 5 minutes. And this is, like I just said, our longest one so far today. Yeah. We couldn't always, though, necessarily commit to the fortnightly. We still call it that, and we do endeavour to give updates to you as regularly as we can. But it's a means for us to engage in another way on a different platform with all of you. You don't, and we've heard before, always necessarily find time in order to just browse the council website and see what's going on in your local area. Not everybody signed up to Wealden Weekly, although I would encourage you to do that, because that's a way that you can find out about planning applications as well as loads of other stuff happening in your local area. But yeah, we're just taking the opportunity to kind of give you thoughts, opinions, updates about stuff that's going on in the planning world in a Wealden context.
Which is also based, it's meant to be based, it's responsive, isn't it? Because we also at the same time set up the Ask the Development Manager forum on the Let's Talk Hub. And there has been quite a few questions that have come through in that way, and we've endeavoured to answer them via the podcast. Yeah.
So it's nothing more complicated than that. It's something that Stacey and I do.
It's not just us.
Well, we're the regular attendees, but it's also something that we share with Nicola Waters, our head of service for the whole gambit of things that she looks after: climate change, planning policy, ECDev, culture, and James Webster, our planning policy manager. And for those that have listened to old episodes, you'll know that we have different guests. We've had other planning officers in the team come along. We've had our ecologists come along to explain certain matters. And we'll continue in that vein. There may always be other voices that you hear moving forward. But yeah.
That's it, I think.
Yeah, we do it off our own back in order to provide you with information that we think you want to hear about and that is valuable.
Yeah.
So if you do or don't think that, then there's always the comment section, and we do encourage you to leave comments in order to kind of let us know what you think about the episode, and particularly if you've got any questions or topic areas that you would like to be dealt with in the future. So please do that, and that's it.
The last thing to update on, and it is a gem at the end, I suppose, for those that have made it this far, we are just making a slight change to the mini reels that we do on social media. So regular listeners and those that subscribe to the social media platforms will have seen for a while we've been doing mini videos and reels on major planning applications, and those are they get a lot of views. And to reflect the change in the planning committees, there is now a new minors reel, or minor applications reel, which we're about to start using, which, I won't describe it, you'll see it, you should notice a slight change. And I think the first one is about to go live today.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thanks very much.
That's a long episode.
It's a long episode. We hope that everyone that started is still listening at the end. We're sure you are. But we will see you next time.
Thanks very much. See you. Bye.